there wasn't anything that could happen in this area called the Yellow Belt. And I think most people know what the Yellow Belt is here, but if you don't, it's this. The previous map shows the city's land use plan. This is a map that is in the official plan. You know, the red areas are your mixed use areas. That's primarily where we grow. The purple areas are your employment areas. Green, obviously, the green spaces. And then the yellow areas, and there's a lot of them, are your stable residential neighborhoods. So from the perspective of efficiently utilizing land in the city, the neighborhoods are probably the least efficient land use, and they're expressly permitted to house people, and yet we make it very difficult to house people in a variety of ways, contrary to that policy I put up earlier. So in and around 2020, City Council, that's them, asked City Planning to take a look at the Yellow Belt. And that was sort of the start of expanding housing options in neighborhoods. There was some work that I did that predated EHON, and it kind of got me obsessed with looking into missing middle housing, which was the laneway suite work. There was the Changing Lanes study that we did back in 2018, and that now allows laneway suites to be built across the city. And laneway suites, I think, are very much a form of missing middle. Now, the scope of the expanding housing options work was to look at introducing all these different types of housing into areas where they could not be built. In most of the yellow area that I showed you earlier, you could only build a detached house. You couldn't build semis or fourplexes or various types of townhouses, walk-up apartments. And that's, you know, can still be the case in a lot of areas, but there's been a lot of incremental reform that is making it easier to do things. But ultimately, the idea of EHON is to make this possible everywhere across the yellow areas in the city, and that continues. So one of the ways that we tried to make this work, we set up a bunch of teams of staff from across city planning, and I'm kind of proud of the way this played out, because most often when you do a study in planning, council says, hey, planners, look at this thing, and then they find somebody with the requisite level of experience and some capacity, and they give somebody the study and they do it. And because we were a couple of months into the pandemic, people were leaving the city. There was a lot of people leaving. We had some staffing issues, and we had a de facto hiring freeze at the time. It was difficult to get the resources to actually take on this work, which was a lot of work. And so one of the things that I suggested was, why don't we ask people who are interested in this stuff, because there's this very significant number of people in city planning who are interested in missing middle housing. They knew the neighborhood policies were kind of bullshit in cases, and like me, they got calls over the years for generally reasonable sounding types of infill housing, but I had to say no, and they had to say no. And at a certain point, you feel like, is this contrary to my role as a planner and my obligation to the public interest? And it is. And so we put out a call to staff across city planning and even other divisions. My friend David's here, who doesn't even work in planning, but he was working on EHON. We had staff from across the city. And the response we got was overwhelming. I got more names of people who wanted to work on this stuff. And this was side of desk. This was in addition to everything else they were doing. They said, no, we think this is important. We want to work on it. So I got all these names, and I got to do a bit of a draft where I got to create all these different teams of people to work on the expanding housing options and neighborhood stuff, from different parts of the city, different levels of experience, people who'd never worked with each other, but people who shared a common interest in advancing this stuff. And I think that was key, because at the time we were losing a lot of people, and what I wanted to make sure was that if anybody left, if a lot of people left, we still would have a core of people who bought into the fundamental idea that this was a good thing. We also, critically, talked to the industry and talked to interested groups and individuals. The industry consultation, I think, was incredibly important, because too often planning undertakes studies without having an idea about whether or not what we're allowing is feasible. So we talked to people in the construction industry, we talked to other planners who have been through the process, and we did that in a variety of ways. I told each one of the groups working on the different aspects of expanding housing options in neighborhoods, go talk to the industry, here are some contacts, but go find more. And they had a lot of luck with that and success. And we also talked to, of course, the residents associations and elected officials, but we also tried to bring in groups of people who aren't represented in public consultation, people who are having trouble finding housing or in very much underhoused situations. We talked to a bunch of advocacy groups that don't generally show up in these kinds of meetings. And what happened was the typical kind of NIMBY talking points that dominate these kinds of conversations when you invite the residents associations primarily to these things. Those got drowned out by people who had very legitimate reasons for wanting housing and wanting multi-generational housing, infill housing. They wanted more options in their neighborhoods. And that helped inform the recommendations we made to council, and I think critically built that political support around doing this. What comes up a lot is that, oh, it's not affordable housing. And it's not. EHON wasn't an affordable housing initiative. It was a market rental housing initiative, primarily. Market ownership to a point when you can condominiumize things, but primarily market rental. And we need a lot more of that in neighborhoods. Because right now in a lot of areas of the city, you can afford to you have to buy a house, rent the entire house, or maybe rent a basement unit in the house. In about 2/3 of the city's neighborhoods, those are your options. And that's either too expensive for some people, or it may not fit with your family situation. So there had to be more options. And that's why we did this, but primarily rental. And over the last several years, there has been, I forget which councillor coined the term, but radical incrementalism, which is a term I like to use still. And in 2018, 2019, you had laneway suites. From there, you had secondary suites, where there used to be this 5-year moratorium on building a secondary suite in a new structure, which was ridiculous. We got rid of that across the city. 2021 was garden suites. 2021 was also removal of parking minimums. Now, this wasn't an EHON project, but we were on the team, and it really helps with making these kind of projects work. In 2022, rooming houses were also approved across the city. Again, not necessarily part of EHON, but part of the spectrum of housing that is important to acknowledge that we need across neighborhoods. And then even before multiplexes were approved, we had the DC changes, which exempt 4 units on a lot from development charges and parks levies, which sort of signaled that, yes, the city's going to approve this multiplex thing eventually. They just weren't there yet. That happened in June of last year. And then fast forward to this year, and also a framework for neighborhood retail spaces, because that's important too. If you're going to have people living in neighborhoods, you want to make sure they have walkable amenities. You want to create complete communities, and so we want to make that easier. There's a place up the street from me, just north of College, and there's a little store, and they wanted to put out a patio, and they got, the neighborhood objected to this, and they hired a lawyer, and the committee turned it down. Now they're going to the board. It's absurd. Why don't you want a patio in your neighborhood at the coffee shop? On a corner store. Crazy. Anyway, it doesn't make a huge impact visually, but you can add hundreds of units in the existing neighborhoods without really noticing it. And you can see it here in context, whether it's in the form of walk-up apartments, various forms of townhouses, secondary suites, garden and laneway suites, and multiplexes. And speaking of which, 2 weeks ago, or maybe a little more, the City of Toronto approved framework for multiplex housing, which is huge, right? I mean, I talked about the options in 2/3 of Toronto being, buying or renting a detached house or maybe a basement apartment. Now people can take properties and they can convert them to 4 units. And a huge thing here, and apart from not having to pay DCs and parks levies, there's no density requirement for these, which makes them a lot more feasible. And that's the result of a lot of people, and a bunch of them in this room, pushing the city to get rid of that FSI or density requirement, which is absurd and shouldn't exist in zoning at all. And the parking requirements, which carry forward from last year, you don't have to build parking for these, so it makes them work. You can build it, of course, but you don't have to. This bylaw amendment is under the appeal period right now. If nobody appeals by June 13th, it will be enforced. People will be off to the races. I've already fielded a bunch of calls from people. I'm working with somebody who bought a lot in Scarborough. They want to split it in 2 and build a 4-plex on each lot. That wouldn't have been possible a couple of years ago, but that's new housing in an area that is almost entirely large detached homes. Looking ahead, this is a map from the city's official plan that identifies all of the major streets across Toronto. These are, well, they're major streets. And so in areas where you have a neighborhood on a major street, you're not really allowed to do that much. You still have to, you have a 4-story limit, generally low-rise stuff. The city's actively working to change that. I don't know where this is going to land, but it is going to land this year, either in draft or in a final report. So keep an eye on this, because I think this will open up a lot of opportunity in areas like Dufferin north of Bloor, which is inexplicably a neighborhood, but is walkable to transit and has lots that could be consolidated and turned into small apartments and other types of missing middle. And then looking post-expanding housing options in neighborhoods, we have to look at neighborhood apartments, walk-up apartments. Some of this work has started with partners at U of T, who are working on some of the missing middle stuff, and TMU as well. We got the schools involved into some of this work as well, which was great. Being able to build this stuff again would be fantastic. It requires the consolidation of lots. And so we have to look at that as well. We also have to allow lot splitting. There's areas in Scarborough which still have policies that require a minimum 50-foot frontage. And for no good reason, really, other than that's how it was 40, 50, 60, 70 years ago, and that's how people wanted it to stay. But those policies really have no place in a city that is growing the way Toronto is and wants to accommodate the amount of people that want to move here. And as Eric was saying earlier, I think quite validly, they want to have security in housing. They want to be able to contribute to the economy. They want to start businesses, and they want the security to be able to do that. I think housing, especially affordable rental housing, housing that is attainable for people, is such an important piece of the economy. Without that, things grind to a halt, and your city gets boring because the people who do interesting things aren't able to do them in the city and live there at the same time. So that's it from me, but I wanted to provide a bit of a background today. Chris, thank you again. This is great. I hope this gives you all a sense of what happened with expanding housing options in neighborhoods. I'm very proud of it. I'm proud of where it's going. And yeah, thank you so much.